but the implication is that it's the best movie. And I don't think that's possible.
Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon from 1950 didn't just tell a story. It completely changed how stories could be told. When Alan first saw this film, he wasn't just watching cinema. He was watching the medium reinvent what it could do. The movie presents one crime from 4 different perspectives, showing how human memory and perception can turn the same event into completely different stories. For Alan, this wasn't just innovative filmmaking. It was validation of everything he'd always felt about human relationships. Every conversation he'd ever replayed in his mind, every moment of self-doubt about what really happened in a situation, every relationship he'd dissected and analyzed, Kurosawa had turned these universal experiences into art. The film gave Alan permission to make everyone in his movies, including himself, unreliable narrators. You can see Rashomon's influence throughout Alan's work. The split screens in Annie Hall that show how the same conversation can be experienced differently by 2 people. The fractured timeline of Deconstructing Harry, and the multiple versions of events in Everyone Says I Love You. From Kurosawa, Alan learned that truth isn't simply what happened. Truth is how we remember what happened, and why we need to remember it in that particular way. But beyond just technique, Rashomon taught Alan about moral complexity. The film has no clear heroes or obvious villains, just human beings making choices under impossible circumstances. Kurosawa's camera moved through the forest setting like conscience itself, revealing some things while hiding others, judging and forgiving characters within the same shot. Alan has often said that cinema's greatest power isn't showing us who we are, but showing us why we can never really know who we are. That insight comes directly from Kurosawa's influence, and it explains why, decades later, Len still talks about Rashomon like it's a sacred text. The Grand Illusion, Humanity Without Manipulation, Jean Renoir's The Grand Illusion from 1937, wasn't really a war movie. It was a movie about people who happened to be caught up in war. When Alan discovered this film, he found something incredibly rare. Great humanity captured on film without sentimentality or emotional manipulation. Just pure, undiluted human observation. The movie wasn't about battles or politics. Instead, it focused on men from different social classes, different countries, and different worldviews who discover that their shared humanity is more important than everything their societies told them should matter. Alan, who always felt like an outsider looking in on Manhattan's social hierarchies, understood this message immediately. The real grand illusion, according to Renoir, isn't war itself. It's all the barriers we build between ourselves and other people. This influence runs through Alan's work like a hidden river. You can see it in the dinner parties in Hannah and Her Sisters, the class dynamics in Crimes and Misdemeanors, and the way wealth and good breeding dissolve under emotional pressure throughout his films. Alan learned from Renoir that the most devastating social commentary doesn't come from preaching to the audience, but from simply watching people be themselves when they're under stress. The film's famous tracking shots, which follow characters through rooms and relationships, taught Alan that cinema could be as fluid as conversation, as natural as breathing. There's no theatrical staging in Renoir's work, no obvious symbolism, just life captured with such precision that it becomes art. Alan once said that the best films don't tell you what to think, they show you how to feel. That's Renoir's lesson distilled. Elegance without pretension, depth without drowning too. He audience, truth without cruelty. Citizen Kane, the birth of cinematic language. Citizen Kane from 1941 is where every film school education begins, but for Alan, it never ended. When he first saw Orson Welles' masterpiece, he wasn't just watching a movie, he was witnessing the birth of cinematic language itself. The deep focus photography made every corner of the frame alive with meaning. The sound design turned ordinary dialogue into music. The camera angles made psychology visible. Alan has called Kane the film that taught him movies could be literature, not just entertainment or simple stories, but actual art with the weight and complexity of great novels. Scenes like the breakfast montage, which shows a marriage dissolving through changing table settings and lighting, or the Hall of Mirrors finale where Kane confronts his own infinite reflections, weren't just scenes. They were symphonies of visual storytelling. But beneath all the technical admiration, Alan found something more personal in Kane. The film's main character has fundamental emptiness behind all his power and success. He's a man who could buy everything except love, who could control everyone except himself. Alan recognized his own future wealthy, miserable characters decades before he would create them. The joke-telling defense mechanisms, the emotional distance disguised as sophistication. Wells showed Alan that American success is often American tragedy dressed in expensive clothes. The film taught him that isolation can be the price of achievement, and that Rosebud isn't just a sled, it's the moment when innocence dies and ambition takes its place. Alan learned Kane's visual vocabulary by heart, but more importantly, he learned its emotional grammar. How to make loneliness cinematic, how to turn personal failure into universal truth, and how to find poetry in the wreckage of human ambition. The 400 Blows, Childhood Without Lies, Francois Truffaut didn't die. Wrecked children in The 400 Blows from 1959, he remembered being one. When Alan first encountered this film, he found something he'd been searching for without knowing it. Childhood without nostalgia, family relationships without sentiment, and growing up without comfortable lies. Young Antoine Doinel, caught between indifferent parents and hostile institutions, became Alan's cinematic alter ego decades before Alan knew he needed one. This wasn't just French New Wave innovation, this was emotional archaeology. Truffaut had excavated the exact moment when childhood dies and adult anxiety is born. Alan, who would spend his career dissecting his own neuroses, recognized the source material. The teacher who doesn't listen, the parents who don't really see their child, the authority figures who mistake control for genuine care. The film's handheld, intimate camera work taught Alan that cameras could breathe with characters instead of just observing them from a distance. Those long takes of Antoine running through Paris streets became the template for Alan's own restless protagonists, always moving, never quite arriving anywhere. The episodic structure showed Alan that life doesn't follow neat three-act formulas. Instead, it follows rhythms of confusion and clarity, connection and isolation. But it's the film's final freeze frame that haunts both directors. Antoine looks directly at the camera, directly at the audience, asking the question Alan would spend 50 years trying to answer: what now? Where do we go when there's nowhere left to run? Truffaut captured the exact moment when possibility becomes responsibility, when dreams collide with reality. Alan found his entire filmmaking philosophy in that frozen face: capture the moment before it disappears, make it permanent, and make it matter. The Seventh Seal, making death cinematic. Ingmar Bergman didn't just make films about death in The Seventh Seal from 1957, he made death itself cinematic. When Alan discovered this film, he found the perfect articulation of his deepest obsession, which wasn't simply the fear of dying, but the terror of meaninglessness. The knight playing chess with death wasn't just a medieval allegory. It was every conversation Alan would ever have with his own mortality. This was existential anxiety turned into high art. Bergman's god-haunted medieval landscape became Alan's godless Manhattan in his later films. But the fundamental questions remained identical. Is there meaning beyond the physical world? Can love survive cosmic indifference? Why do we suffer if there's no one keeping score? Alan found permission in Bergman's darkness to make comedy from cosmic dread. The film's visual poetry, those stark silhouettes against barren skies, taught Alan that profound questions didn't require naturalistic settings. His later films would place characters against backdrops of wealth and culture, but underneath, they're all playing the same chess game: time versus meaning, pleasure versus purpose, knowledge versus faith. Bergman's famous Silence of God became Alan's neurotic chatter in his films. Both are responses to the same fundamental void. The knight's desperate search for one meaningful act before the game ends echoes through every Alan protagonist trying to justify their existence through art, love, or simple human connection. Alan once said he didn't want to achieve immortality through his work. He wanted to achieve it by not dying. That's pure Bergman influence. The film's medieval pageantry masked timeless human terror, and for Alan, the dance of death wasn't a metaphor. It was a prophecy. The Seventh Seal showed Alan that asking the biggest questions doesn't require having the answers. Sometimes the chess game itself is enough. Bicycle Thieves, survival as art. Some films show you life, while others show you survival. When Allen first encountered Vittorio De Sica's Bicycle Thieves from 1948, he wasn't just watching Italian neo-realism. He was staring into a mirror that reflected every anxiety he'd ever felt about maintaining dignity while the world crumbles around you. The film wasn't really about stolen bicycles. It was about stolen hope, stolen faith, and stolen innocence. The desperate father searching Rome's streets with his young son became Allen's template for every relationship he would ever examine in his films. The parent trying to remain heroic in a child's eyes while secretly falling apart inside, the moral compromises that survival demands, and the moment when ordinary people face extraordinary moral crises. De Sica's Rome, scarred by war and poverty, became Allen's emotional landscape decades before he set foot in Manhattan as a filmmaker. The same economic anxiety, the same social pretensions, the same human need to appear successful while privately drowning. Allen saw himself in that desperate father, not in the actual theft, but in the desperation to preserve some shred of dignity when everything else has been stripped away. The film's naturalistic style, real locations, non-professional actors, taught Allen that authenticity trumps artifice every time. Those long takes of the father and son walking through crowds showed Allen how cinema could capture the real rhythm of human relationships. The weight of disappointment, the burden of being someone's hero when you can barely save yourself. That final scene with father and son walking into the crowd became Allen's visual signature throughout his career. Anonymous figures lost in urban masses, carrying private pain through public spaces. Bicycle Thieves gave Allen his emotional vocabulary. How to find universal truth in personal failure, how to make heartbreak cinematic, and how to turn simple survival into art. The lasting influence. Allen doesn't just collect great films. He collects different ways of seeing the world. These 6 directors gave him different lenses for examining human frailty, moral complexity, and cosmic anxiety. In his own neurotic, brilliant way, he spent decades combining their visions into something uniquely his own. From Kurosawa, he learned that truth is subjective and memory is unreliable. From Renoir, he discovered that humanity shines brightest under pressure. From Wells, he understood that technical innovation must serve emotional truth. From Truffaut, he grasped that childhood trauma echoes through adult anxiety. From Bergman, he accepted that existential questions don't require answers. From De Sica, he realized that dignity and desperation often walk hand in hand. These 6 films became Allen's artistic DNA, shaping not just his technique, but his entire worldview. They taught him that cinema could be archaeology, philosophy, and therapy all at once. Most importantly, they showed him that asking difficult questions about human nature, even without providing answers, could be enough to create meaningful art. The influence of these masters can be traced through every Allen film, from his early comedies to his later dramatic works. They gave him permission to be neurotic, philosophical, and deeply human all at the same time. In return, he spent his career proving that their lessons about truth, mortality, and human connection could find new expression in the streets of Manhattan, spoken through the voices of anxious intellectuals trying to make sense of an indifferent universe. 6 films, 1 artistic inheritance, and infinite possibilities for exploring what it means to be human in a complex world.